No mythology today. Tell me about a defunct theory. Tell me something interesting. Pique my interesting lobes.
Well, I'm glad you asked, Chauncey,
Are you?
spontaneously.
Because
Um,
I'm questioning how I asked it, but go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I'm not going to stimulate your lobes, but for thousands of years, basically from the time of antiquity up into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, um, it really held on until like the 1850s. People believed that certain, um, well, it's called the theory of spontaneous generation. The theory basically states that creatures like fleas and maggots are not descended from parents, but rather form spontaneously from certain types of matter. Basically, if you have a big enough hunk of rotten cheese sitting around, they thought, then the cheese and like the dust around it will start spontaneously becoming flies. This was thought to work through primal elemental interactions between different types of matter, warm matter, wet matter, light, heat, cold, etc. Early in the 1st century BC, Vitruvius, a Roman architect, advised that libraries be placed facing eastward for good morning light, but not with windows facing south or west, since the south and west winds could spontaneously generate bookworms. This belief persisted throughout the Middle Ages. One of my favorite and wildest stories is that stating that because the barnacle goose was thought to form spontaneously from a type of barnacle, hence the name, therefore, it A, proved the virgin birth, and B, proved that the barnacle goose was actually properly considered a type of fish and therefore acceptable to eat during Lent. Shakespeare talks about snakes and crocodiles forming from the mud of the Nile. And nevertheless, many religious people did object to spontaneous generation, finding that the idea that life could spontaneously form from the chaos of the world to be irreligious, sort of pagan, since it was based on Greek myth, as God was supposed to have created everything with intention. People first started doing experiments to disprove spontaneous generation in the late 1600s and found that the church was right. And by the 1850s, with the experiments of Louis Pasteur on this, famous for the process of pasteurization, its advocates were forced to admit it wasn't true, and it basically fell out of the popular consciousness.
Wonder how society dealt with that, because we're dealing with that stuff right now, a lot of science this, science that, and then when science comes out, do people just go like, oh well, I wasn't sure anyway? It's like,
Yeah.
or maybe like you said, science just progresses one death at a time. But that makes sense. You look at the world, you see what happens, and this is why people think the earth is flat. They went out their front door and it looked flat, and they said, like, hey, you're tricking me.
Right. And yeah, I mean, this originated with like a lot of creatures have eggs that are too small to see.
Right.
So that's the root of spontaneous generation theory. And people sort of worked into that, like ideas about the 4 elements and ideas about like, because the Greek view of cosmology was that everything began with chaos. Chaos in our modern parlance generally means like disorder, like randomness. To them, the word chaos literally means an opening. It meant void. And the idea was that things could spontaneously generate. So basically the first gods spontaneously generated from chaos, who created everything.
Yeah, there was a lot of magic.
Right.
Thinking that the bookworms come from which wind? Who cares? That the bookworms come from the wind. It's beautiful. Yeah. There's no magic like that in my life.
I know. Honestly, I think it would be so cool if spontaneous generation was real. Like, inconvenient, but interesting.
Yeah. But I've played enough video games to know that it'd be scary to go walking in the park or out in a field because, you might spontaneously
it's just like random
some
encounters.
Sort of bad guy that you got to fight.
Yeah.
And it's like your Pokemon's tired and you're just not ready for it.
Right. So spontaneous generation never fell out of favor in the Pokemon universe. The Pokemon are spontaneously generated from the tall grass.
Yeah. Yeah. Spawning points. Yeah.
Yeah. But honestly, I think this is a reasonable, because, scientific theories, and this wasn't a scientific theory by any means in the modern sense, it was developed by philosophers, not people doing like any form of the best they had method.
at the time.
Right. But it's the analog. It formed the the same function in society. These things, I think, ultimately, all theories are, we go with them because they're practical. And this is, in many ways, a practical theory. It stems from the observation, if you leave rot and dirt and stuff everywhere, then you're going to get flies. It doesn't matter why it's wrong exactly.
Right.
It tells you, get rid of this stuff, it's going to spontaneously generate. And if it makes a few, false predictions, so people end up doing silly things like not putting windows so that there are bookworms, it's still like, it's mostly useful. And that's all theory had to be to stick around. It's mostly useful.
Yeah, I gotta say, they're not wrong. If you take an apple and you take some wet matter and some warm matter and leave them outside long enough, you will get maggots on that sucker.
Right. And it's kind of like Occam's razor. To people, this was like, well, this is simpler than invisible eggs. This makes more sense to us. This is more pleasing to us. And in absence of any evidence to prove that it's, because actually these creatures are laying invisible eggs theory is almost as old. Like, that was a rival theory to spontaneous generation. But people liked spontaneous generation more, basically. And since they didn't have evidence either way, they went with the one they liked more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I personally like it more too, because it's got some magic to it.
Yeah.
As
interesting.
For anybody listening, my day job is I'm a web developer. I do website stuff. And there's a lot of website nerds that are just all like, oh yeah, well, it needs to be done the right way, and this is the right way, and there's no other way to do it. And I'm constantly because I teach some classes about this too, and I constantly have to say to them, no, the right way is to get it done on time and within budget. That's the right way, and so once it's done, you move on. If you have some extra time, you then think about better ways that you could do it in the future, and so on and so forth. And you were just saying this about it was the working theory at the time, and it is the working theory. It works. It's not exactly a pressing issue. Let's leave that for a bit until we have some time to work on this side hobby of ours with the invisible eggs and spontaneous.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And it's real. A lot of people don't know, but like Greek doctors, Paracelsus and stuff, they saved people. They did, in fact, save lives. Obviously, they were much worse than like modern doctors. But they weren't really that much worse than like 19th century doctors.
Yeah, if they had just washed their hands, they probably wouldn't have been that bad.
No, exactly. Yeah, and they had wild beliefs. They
had they known about the invisible eggs,
right?
And washed their hands, it wouldn't hurt.
They didn't remotely understand how the body worked, but what they did was they saved lives because they wrote everything down. They had a patient who presented a certain way. They wrote it down, send it on to the next person. They know this patient presented this way, they'll get X, Y, and Z. We don't know why, probably because of like spirit humors in the blood or some magical nonsense. Best treat, of all the people who had this, the only one who lived got this herb, so maybe try that herb.
Right. There's an old SNL with Steve Martin, and he's like the town barber, which at the time was like the doctor or whatever in some old town, Middle Ages town. And somebody comes up and their stomach is hurting and stuff like that. And he's just, oh, I'm possessed. I have a stomach ache and blah, blah, blah. And he's all, yes, we used to think that you had a demon and you were possessed. But now we know that a small dwarf has taken up residence in your stomach. Just go ahead and take this and that'll take care of it, And it's like a whole bunch of like, we used to believe this bat caca thing, and now we believe this one.
Reality isn't any less weird.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you my invisible egg story before we're out of here.
All right.
My wife is a year older than I am, and her best friend is a year younger. I actually met her best friend first when I was 15, and I met her best friend, and she introduced me to Terry, my wife, when she was 16, and that's when we all met each other and became friends. And at the time when I was friends with a friend, she comes over and she had a baby young. She had a baby just prior to turning 15. So she comes over and she's spending the night at my house, platonic, you know, not getting weird. And she brings her baby, and I cook them dinner, and I cook them some rice. Matt was there, maybe he cooked, doesn't matter. We cook some rice, we eat the rice, it's all great. And she's looking through the rice, and she like pulls up something and looks at it, and the rice was like 30% boll weevils. And we've been eating this. We fed our kid this. We all just ate like
I hate
boll weevils in the rice. And and she was like pissed, like, you fed my baby boll weevils, and like,
well, yeah.
And we didn't know, you know, and like, I'll tell you this. To this day, this girl lives 2 blocks away from me, and I swear to God, once every 6 months at least, I hear about how I fed her baby boll weevils.
Okay, I mean, she can probably calm down if it's been like 30 years, but also,
yeah,
that's horrible.
All right, you're listening to Radio Wasteland. You know, come back next time.
Chicken rice for boll weevils.